Okay, I have 12 o'clock, so I'll get started. So welcome everybody. This is webinar number 4 in our early landscape of neuropsychological changes in Alzheimer's and Alzheimer's related dementia webinar series. I'm Luke Stokel from the Division of Behavioral and Social Research at the National Institute on Aging. On the screen in front of you is a set of reminders for today's webinar. First and foremost, please mute yourself. Stay curious. We're going to take questions in the chat box, so throw those in there. During the Q&A, which will follow each talk, and also we'll have a Q&A at the end, speakers will get the first shot at questions, and then we'll go by chat. Our esteemed moderator, Dr. Brad Dickerson, will be leading that discussion, along with Liz Necka from the Division of Behavioral Social Research at NIA as well. And then after the webinar series, please follow up with communication myself or Ella Blue from RLA, who is running all the logistics and the behind the scene action here. I want to kick off the very first talk from Dr. Jonas Gedda, and thank everybody again on behalf of myself, Maya Geddes, Bob Bilder, and Laura Germain of the leadership team. This has been a fantastic series, and we have no doubt that this event today will not disappoint as well. So welcome and thanks. Jonas?
Thank you, Luke. I would like to share my slides. Hello, everyone. My name is Jonas Gedda. I'm a professor of neurology at Barrow Neurological Institute. Prior to that, for 25 years, I was at Mayo Clinic in Minnesota primarily. I trained under Ron Peterson, co-mentors in neuropsychology, Glenn Smith, and in neuroepidemiology, Walter Rocca. So I'll be talking about neuropsychiatric symptoms, behaviors, and socio-emotional function. So the exposure of interest for my talk is about neuropsychiatric symptoms. And then I assume I will be considering ADRD, Alzheimer's disease, and related dementia, including MCI, as the outcome of interest. So focusing on neuropsychiatric symptoms, really, how do you measure private experience? So the famous psychologist Steve Hayes refers to emotions and thoughts as private experience. So it's really challenging to measure neuropsychiatric symptoms. Really, if you do not measure it, it doesn't exist. It truly applies here. Before Jeff Cummings developed neuropsychiatric inventory, we didn't hear much about neuropsychiatric symptoms in ADRD. After he developed this scale, we started measuring it. It has become now quite popular. So NPI, which later on his mentee, Dan Coffer, and he published NPIQ, the late Dan Coffer published it with his mentor, Jeff Cummings, in 2000, NPIQ. Basically, it measures apathy, depression, anxiety, agitation, etc. So here is one typical research question. Let me get rid of this thing. So I am 70 years old. Does excessive negative emotion impact my memory and thinking? So this is a very common issue. And indeed, Alzheimer's Association was concerned about this, and they assembled an experts to come up with a biological model to investigate neuropsychiatric symptoms in Alzheimer's disease. We published our findings in 2013. I was the lead investigator with Kostas Laiketsos as a senior author. So basically, we suggested to combine these three models: the frontal subcortical circuit, Alexander, and then later on Jeffrey Cummings reported, and then cortical network that Marcel Mesulam published. If you are interested, you can read his single-authored 40-page paper in Brain from 1991, and then the monoaminergic system, so cell bodies in the southern brainstem projecting diffusely to the cortex and other parts of the brain. So these three, I'm sure you are familiar. So we combine these three and try to come up with a biological model. And now, what are the time sequence of events after we developed the biological model in 2013? So one of the major outcome is that the same expert panel published on mild behavioral impairment. So Ismail Zahinur and myself and Kostas Raiketsos, we published on this. And how do we measure MBI? By using the MBI checklist, we published on that 2017. I will not go into MBI. Later on, Ipsit will be talking about that. So the MBI checklist really, it measures 5 domains. And it's based really, derived from, based on the work on NPI and NPIQ, and interest, motivation, and drive, mood or anxiety, gratification, delay, impulse control, comportment and empathy, strongly held beliefs and sensory experiences. These are the 5 major areas that MBI checklist measures. So I want to indicate that really all roads lead to Rome. I'm going to show you a couple of slides to prove this argument. So if you take a look, I'll show you in the next slide, the point estimates and confidence intervals that measure the association between neuropsychiatric symptoms and cognitive outcomes, they indicate increased risk. They're always above 1. And interestingly, the point estimates that measure the association between physical activity and cognitive outcomes indicate decreased risk, and they tend to be below 1. So here, so in the same population, this is, we took 1,587 people. We followed them for about 5 years, median time. And this is the exposed cohort, cognitively normal people with neuropsychiatric symptoms above age 70, the unexposed cohort, 70 years old and older, men and women, cognitive normal without neuropsychiatric symptoms. We followed them forward in time to incident MCI. And this is what we found. So depression increases the risk of MCI. Take a look, point estimate above 1, significant. Apathy above 1, agitation above 1, so increased risk. Take a look about our exercise. In the same population, we looked at exercise data. So in midlife, took a look, the point estimates are always below 1. This is not significant, but this one's point in the same direction. In late life, after age 70, if a person exercises light intensity or moderate, and as you can see, the point estimates are below 1. So very interesting that the psychiatric exposure, neuropsychiatric symptom tend to increase risk. In general, exercise and physical activity tend to decrease risk of MCI. So what is the mechanism that links neuropsychiatric symptoms with MCI or dementia? In our 2013 paper, we published about 4 possible mechanisms, the etiologic pathway. So neuropsychiatric symptoms through some mechanism, for example, excessive severe depression may increase corticosteroids, impact hippocampus, and may lead to MCI. The shared risk factor, amyloid deposition, may be driving both the psychiatric and cognitive, or reverse causality, basically, in layman's term, basically reaction to the sleeping cognition. And then the other one is interaction. So biological model may synergistically interact with psychiatric symptom and lead to increased risk of MCI. We have actually empirically shown that ApoE4 increases your risk of MCI by 1.9, depression by 2. When the 2 are together, the risk increases to 5. So 2 plus 2 becomes 5. So really synergistic interaction. And so I would like to acknowledge the funding for this work, the National Institute on Aging and Mayo Clinic Study of Aging, really by the program officer, Dallas Anderson, has been really since 2004. He has been guiding and giving us really sound counsel with his really exceptional communication style. He gives you candid feedback without making you feel defensive. I would like to acknowledge that, and I think that's it. Thank you very much. And if there are questions, I will answer them later on.
Thank you, Jonas. I want to just reflect from my own clinical experience in taking care of patients with cognitive impairment. I think that there are, as you wrote in the paper from 10 years ago, and just briefly summarized, there are patients that have insight into their cognitive losses, such as we often see in people with posterior cortical atrophy syndrome, where they're really confronted every day with the losses they have when it comes to processing information from their environment visually and tactilely and so forth. I think that many of them have anxiety or depressive symptoms that feel congruent with the kinds of losses they're experiencing. And so I wonder, on the other hand, I feel like some of them really have the kinds of catastrophic reactions that I think, may be problems with emotional regulation or affective regulation. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about your thoughts about, as a clinician, and ultimately as we think about how to study these things more scientifically, how would you try to begin to separate the idea of a psychological reaction to a loss that a person is experiencing as part of their age-related or pathologically related cognitive decline from something that might be more biologically driven?
So I think this is a perennial question. It's always raised the chicken and egg issue. It's always raised, but I think when it comes to clinical setting, when you come to the unit of intervention, when it is an individual, we need to look, we need to address that. For example, in some patients, indeed, psychological reaction may have a major role. But at a group level, at an aggregate group level, when we assemble a cohort and address this question, then I think we can look into, fortunately, we have funding from NIA to address this question. So we were using the Rochester Epidemiology Project since 1907. Any human being that lived in Rochester, Minnesota, since 1907 had their medical care there, their medical record is captured. So we're trying to look at lifelong exposure. So that's really a unique data set where we can really tell if a person had psychiatric exposure before age 40, before age 50, or before age 60 at any time. So it's partly to address this. And then we are trying to also, we assemble a cognitively normal people. And then we use, at baseline, we have the neuroimaging biomarkers, and then follow them forward in time to incident MCI events. On these individuals, we have gathered data. So hopefully that will help us to sort it out. That's why we came up with this ambitious plan to look at, these are participants above age 70. We're looking at the record since birth, some of them. So since age 10 years, from 70 to 40. So we are addressing that, but still, to be honest with you, my thinking is that there is the leading hypothesis, in my opinion, is there is a synergistic interaction between the biological process going on and the psychiatric symptoms, because there is the input also. Remember, there is a latent variable. So there is also degeneration of serotonergic neurons that also leads to psychiatric symptom. The AD pathology is contributing. That synergistic interaction could lead to cognitive problems. So I think the interaction is, I find it more attractive theory at a group level. At individual clinic level, I think you have to make your judgment there.
Thank you, Jonas. We appreciate it. Okay, well, lots more we could talk about, and happy to bring in questions or comments for the larger discussion at the end. So let's move now to Ipsit Vahia in your presentation. Thank you.
My name is Ipsit Vahia. I'm a geriatric psychiatrist and the Associate Chief of Geropsychiatry at McLean. I'm also the Medical Director of the McLean Institute for Technology and Psychiatry. And my research focuses largely on digital approaches to mental health care in late life. And nothing significant in my disclosures, except I will be talking about a collaboration with Emerald Innovations that Dina Katavi spoke about at the previous seminar. And I also want to acknowledge that my talk has ties to Rhoda O's presentation last week, the last session. And it has some synergy with what Jonas talked about. But to tell the story of precision phenotyping, I think the story that we actually end up telling is one of imprecision and imprecision around behavior symptoms in late life. So let's consider the entity known as subsyndromal depression, which is defined as the presence of depressive symptoms not meeting the DSM criteria for major depression. And to meet this, the presence of even one symptom may be adequate. Now, this is not an entity that you will find in major depression. It's something that we sort of diagnose and treat by clinical and expert consensus. But there isn't even a consistent literature on it because there hasn't been a definition for it. So across studies over the past 25 years, you will find the same entity referred to variously as minor depression or subthreshold depression or non-major depression or brief reactive depression. What we do know, though, is that no matter how you define it, it's about 3 to 5 times more common in older adults, and that even one symptom can impact functioning or quality of life. So this isn't even something that we have a good clinical pathway to, much less well-defined research portfolio around this. Why is this important? Because there is actually very good research, and I'm going to cite 2 studies, but there's at least 8 or 10, that indicate that late life depression may not be one thing. So these are data from the Whitehall study. This was published in JAMA Psychiatry in 2017, where they looked at over 10,000 people over a 28-period span. And they found that in 1985, when this study started, that there was not really much difference in risk of dementia between those with depression and those without depression. But as they tracked these people longer, they found that about 10 years before a diagnosis of dementia was made, that the rates of depression in those with in those that eventually develop dementia started to go up, and that by the time the dementia diagnosis was made, the rate of depression previously was almost 9 times higher. So there's something here that indicates that the presence of depression can predate dementia by almost a decade. So the question then is depression a risk factor? Or is there a form of depression that's part of the dementia syndrome that starts, that just manifests before the neurocognitive symptoms do? We have data that suggests that, in fact, the nature of depressive symptoms in people that will eventually develop dementia may be different from depression that occurs without eventually turning into dementia. So this is the study from Kostas Liketsos's group that indicates that in their longitudinal cohort, about 59% of people developed some form of neuropsychiatric symptoms before a cognitive diagnosis was even made. Now this was a pooled analysis, so it includes people that developed MCI, Alzheimer's disease, but also frontotemporal symptoms. Here's where it gets interesting, that they were actually able to phenotype specific subdomains of the depression syndrome. And they found that the most common domain was irritability, followed by depressed mood, then insomnia and anxiety. This matters because these are actually quite distinct as far as individual symptoms go, even though they're all clustered together under NPS or even under depression. Our current diagnostic standards actually give us no way to acknowledge this heterogeneity. So the DSM will let you diagnose whether or not someone has behavior disturbance, but it puts everything from violent agitation to apathy under the same diagnostic category. And the ICD follows suit, where there's an ICD code that's a qualifier for behavior symptoms secondary to dementia, but there's no way to actually acknowledge the heterogeneity. And what we know now is that clinical heterogeneity is just a manifestation of distinct neurobiological processes, except we don't have names for them, much less good ways to measure them or identify what might be going on. And to this end, I think the identification and the description of the entity of mild behavioral impairment was a massive step forward. Jonas was among the authors of this. But I'll quickly run through the criteria. What it basically acknowledges is that changes in behavior or personality after age 50, and this matters, present for at least 6 months. So there's a room in this category to sort of recognize that this is a longitudinal, slow-moving process. And that it actually captures 5 quite distinct phenomena: decreased motivation, affective dysregulation, impulse discontrol, social inappropriateness, and abnormal perception or thought content. Not better explained by other psychopathology or the presence of dementia. So this is where mild behavior impairment and neuropsychiatric symptoms diverge, so that MBI is a more precisely defined entity. And there's a checklist called the MBI checklist that has allowed the quantification of MBI. And the checklist is a reflection of the ISTART criteria. So it's 34 questions, not short, but not long either, and really clinically very usable, that measures 5 distinct domains. And it's possible through factor analyses and other measures to map out each domain score separately. The creation of the MBI checklist has actually allowed us to validate the MBI construct. And that's now been done in a number of different ways by comparing it to the NPIQ, which was the gold standard before. But also there's been longitudinal validation in cohorts of people with mild cognitive impairment, self-reported cognitive decline, and in normal controls. More importantly, though, I think we've been able to validate with the help of the MBIC the presence of this entity by demonstrating brain changes using a large number of brain biomarkers. So it sort of proves the point that once you can define an entity, you can measure it and you can quantify and validate it. We've been able to show that MBI is quite distinct from depression because people with mild behavioral impairment had an 8 times higher hazard ratio. But where digital phenotyping comes in is that we now actually have ways to deconstruct the entire DSM nosology. So this is a paper we wrote where we showed that there is a validated digital approach to actually quantify each of the 9 DSM criteria, 8 of the 9 DSM subdomains of depression, which means you could capture subsyndromal depression digitally far better than with any technique that came before it. And in our work with Dina Katabi, we've sort of tried to do proof of concept of this. So we use the Emerald device. And this is an example of how using digital phenotyping correlated with clinical information, you can pick up on paranoia, for example. So Emerald showed us that over a course of weeks, this one lady was spending time standing for inordinate amounts of time in these 5 specific spots in her room. And we found out later that that's because that's where she was avoiding the poison gases being pumped in through the vents by the staff. We were able to show—
1 minute, Ipsit.
Thank you. We were able to show apathy by being able to localize using the radio sensors, the amount of time spent by this lady on her couch increasing over a 3-week period. And then using Emerald, we were also able to, each of these is, this is a staggering amount of data, concentric circles where you can see what the person did in their room over the course of a day. So this is 4 months of activity, showing a complete fragmentation of the circadian rhythm. So gray circles are when this person didn't get out of bed. White circles are when they did not get into bed. And you can see insomnia and hypersomnia alternating. Now, this is not early dementia. This isn't someone with quite advanced dementia. But these are 3 individual cases that give us proof of concept of how we can apply highly precise phenotyping to quantify behavior. And I think this is the big challenge before us, which is turning this ability to get rich intra-individual level data and apply them to inter-individual comparisons that will eventually let us phenotype specific domains of mild behavior impairment, and maybe lead to something that can in turn be applied at scale. Thank you.
Thank you, Ipsit. I'm intrigued by the idea that you and Jonas called attention to, which is we have MCI, which requires people to experience symptoms of some kind of cognitive impairment and have at least a sign of some kind of cognitive impairment on office-based cognitive testing or neuropsychological testing or whatever assessment we want to use. When we think about MBI or when we think about subsyndromal depression, what are your thoughts about what we should be doing? And I know you've been doing a lot of this work yourself, and you alluded to it right at the end there, to bring in more, objective tests that might reflect aspects of, let's say, depression, as you were just touching on, so that we could really say, okay, if this person has sort of a pre-depression state or a subsyndromal depression with symptoms that may just be one symptom, as you said, but also a sign, hopefully it would maybe tighten up that construct a little bit and could be extended to MBI, where I think we all recognize that the current absence of any kind of real signs that are, measurable in the usual sense medically is a problem. So I know you've thought a lot about this. I wonder if you could just make a few comments on that.
Yeah, I think that's it. It really cuts to the heart of the issue. The problem is that when you see these symptoms, it's not always clear whether it's dementia related or not related to dementia. So I think we first need to get used to the idea that there's almost always something more going on than what we get in self-report in a clinical setting. And we're, for example, implementing the MBI just in our clinic as a straight clinical tool, with the idea that someone could present with a new onset late life depression, but using the MBI is one way to maybe get at the fact that there may be more subtle symptoms that a clinical interview may not capture. Insofar as digital phenotyping goes, we're not at a point, I think, where we can pin down on specific symptoms with a great degree of precision. I like the Emerald because it checks off a lot of what we want from our measurement systems. It's a minimal burden of use, really quite accessible, but it generates extraordinary amounts of data. And I think finding the signal in the noise is not as simple. We're looking to see if you could just use a straight wearable device, because that gives you slightly more pre-processed information. It's not as accurate and it's not as granular, but it may be a more efficient way at picking up some of these signals that kind of clue you into what's depression versus what's MBI. But it's the great unknown. I mean, as I mentioned to Luke, I'm just delighted to be part of this discussion, because this is the piece we need to figure out, that in fact, if there are symptoms that are occurring up to a decade before cognitive impairment, then we really need to be channeling our energies into teasing out all of these confounds, because we may be able to develop treatments much faster.
Just to add a little bit, to be honest with you, the measurement of private experiences, psychiatric symptoms, emotions, in my opinion, still there is no breakthrough. I think NPI-Q, NPI, MBI, it helps us. So we, at one time, actually, neuropsychological measures were not easy to measure until, Edith Kaplan and, Harold Goodglass and Edith and others were able to measure cognitive cognition. They have systematized it. We need to have a similar approach, really. I wish we had included when we did the MBI work, I wish we had neuropsychologists and others who are experts in psychometrics. I wish we had involvement with them. I think my message is that if you are a neurologist or psychiatrist, if you plan to measure emotion and new psychiatric symptoms, reach out to psychologists, neuropsychologists at the earliest possible time, because they are trained in psychometrics. I only took one class from Glenn Smith, and I don't even remember what I learned. So I think it's very critical to team up. MMPI, for example, MMPI historically in the 1940s, an engineer and a psychologist collaborated and came up with this really elaborate and systematic way of measuring about 10 personality attributes. I think that is the type of model we should probably promote. That's the bigger issue I want to bring.
And we can discuss this later, but I hope we get to spend some time sort of talking about moving away from things like depression and get more specific about irritability or apathy or agitation or insomnia. I think that's probably the way forward. It involves deconstructing the syndromes that we're too used to working with.
I think that's a great point, Ipsit. I mean, we're stuck in what I think many of us view as outdated constructs at this point for these things. So thank you. So let's come back to that in the discussion. But our third speaker for today's session is Virginia Sturm. So we look forward to hearing your presentation, Virginia. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks so much for having me. And this conversation so far has been really interesting, and I hope to build on it with what I'm going to talk about here. So I'm a neuropsychologist and a neuroscientist at the UCSF Memory and Aging Center. And as a psychologist embedded in a neurology department, I really strive to do what was just kind of talked about, and bringing my field, which is affective science, to the world of neurodegenerative diseases. And so I'll be focusing mostly on some methods that we've tried to use over the years to unpack some of these really complicated constructs and behaviors that we've been hearing about already. So I would like to offer that emotions are very challenging to study, as has been noted, as they're these internal experiences, but that we can approach them with objective measures, and we can study them with rigor in a scientific way. And so there's lots of definitions of emotions and controversies about what emotions are. So I'll just offer this quick kind of framework for how I think about them, and this kind of underlies a lot of the studies that I've done. But emotions are complex. They're multi-system phenomena. They're often brief. They are often unbidden, and they kind of come over us. And they do have these psychological components where they shift our memories and they make thoughts more likely than others. And they are, of course, accompanied by these very specific sets of feelings. And they make certain actions and facial expressions and movements more likely when we feel certain ways. And physiologically, emotions alter the activity in the autonomic nervous system. And together, this whole kind of, again, multi-system response motivates us to take action. And so each emotion serves a very specific function in our lives. And we think of emotions as being really kind of dependent on different systems in the brain. But one system that's kind of central here is what we refer to as the salience network here. And the salience network can be measured with a variety of tools, and including things like structural imaging and functional resting state imaging. And one kind of helpful framework that we often think about here at UCSF is thinking about how emotions kind of decline often in diseases such as behavioral variant frontotemporal dementia. But in other diseases, they show a different pattern. And in Alzheimer's disease, there's been some evidence where the salience network has elevated connectivity. And so based on these different patterns of neural changes, we would have different predictions and hypotheses about how behavior and emotions would change over the course of the illness. So, measuring emotions is really hard, as we've heard, and a lot of the time we have to rely on the patient's self-reported experience. As Brad mentioned, sometimes they have insights, sometimes they don't. We ask family members lots of questions. Sometimes they're great historians and observers, sometimes they're less great. And we can ask them to fill out lots of questionnaires, and we can do observer kinds of checklists, and that's helped us make incredible progress in the field. To capture the more, what we refer to as objective kind of components of these different behaviors, we bring them into a lab, such as the one you just saw, and we measure lots of things. This is just some examples of the different kinds of autonomic nervous system measures that we obtain. Well, we bring people into the lab, we hook them up, and then we videotape them, and we have them do a variety of different kinds of tasks that help them to feel different emotions with watching video clips, for example, or having them to feel empathy for another person. Later, we code their facial expression with various different means. And of course, we ask them different questions about how they felt and what they understood about all the different tasks in our battery. So this kind of multi-method approach looks kind of like this. So for example, we often have them sit through a baseline period where they look at an X and then they watch a movie. Here's the baby video. This is an example from one of our kids studies, so don't worry, this is not our older adults work. But this is a child who was watching that video, and you can see we can align the different the stimuli with how his face kind of like reacted to those different clips. And then here's an example of some of the different physiological signals that we measured as he was watching the different videos. So we can align these different kinds of streams of data, and then we can extract the different kinds of metrics out of each signal. So we get heart rate, and we get respiration, and we can measure skin conductance. And we clean all this data with semi-automated pipelines. And then we eventually extract second-by-second averages for each of the channels. And then finally, we can reduce these things into baseline versus trial and look for differences in how someone responded to a movie from baseline. And we can compare someone with Alzheimer's to someone without Alzheimer's, for example, to see if they had a deficit in some specific kind of aspect of emotion. So the goal here is really to kind of hone in on exactly what part of the emotion system might be struggling and what parts are working well. So that's the physiological autonomic side of the work. We also really pay a lot of attention to facial behavior, and facial behavior can be measured with various different approaches. We still use manual approaches such as the facial action coding system, or FACS. In this system, we look at the face with different action units. So the AUs are different numbered sets of muscles that you can learn and be trained on how to identify varying levels of intensity and change in these different movements in the face. Here's some examples of what they look like. So these are pretty extreme examples. A lot of the movements are more subtle. But once you code every single second of the data with all these different combinations of movements and different intensities, then we have to put it all together and figure out, well, what does that mean? You know, what does it mean if someone moves their inner corner of their eyebrow up? And we kind of have to translate that into what emotion they may be feeling. And that too is very controversial and complicated to align those movements in the face with the felt experience or what we believe to be the internal state. So just to give some examples of some things that we found with this approach, as I mentioned, a lot of our work has been in behavioral variant FTD because, you know, that's a syndrome with clear behavioral abnormalities, but we've also done work in Alzheimer's. And increasingly, we're moving to the preclinical stages, trying to answer those questions about, you know, are there things that occur even before cognitive change in the emotion system that we can quantify even prior to awareness or overt decline. So in BVFTD, these are some examples. You know, we've measured embarrassment, healthy controls there as HC and FTD. People with BVFTD are, you know, they don't show facial expressions of embarrassment or the autonomic changes of embarrassment. And then we can go and link these different deficits that we find in the lab to the brain with things like voxel-based morphometry or resting state analyses. We've seen different deficits in disgust reactivity, same kind of pattern. This has been associated with the insula atrophy. And we've also seen in FTD that there's these, even at rest, different baseline abnormalities such as lower parasympathetic activity, which tends to relate to left insular dysfunction, as well as sympathetic activity, which has different kind of largely subcortical and temporal correlates. So, you know, there's lots of reasons why more people don't do this work. I think it has lots of different challenges associated with it, but I do think it has the potential to kind of contribute to this conversation about quantifying behavior and different aspects of the emotion kind of landscape with these more objective approaches. So some of the challenges that just pop into mind, you know, are cleaning the autonomic nervous system data is extremely time consuming. It's hard to, you know, clean the data, reduce the data. There's a lot of kind of static approaches to looking at change scores and averages, which has been fruitful, but I think we can do better. We can look at different kind of metrics from this data. And I think there's definitely innovation we could is needed in this area to kind of advance the field and our understanding of the autonomic nervous system. The facial behavior work, there are some automated systems out there. We've tested a lot of them. They're not as good as we would like them to be, unfortunately. Training people to use the coding systems we use takes months, and coding is extremely slow depending on what system you use. It can take hours to code just minutes of data. And I have a dream that one day we will have beautiful automated systems that will give us facial expression metrics over time. That would be amazing. And yeah, bringing someone into a laboratory is really limiting. It's not scalable. So I think to access larger samples, more diverse samples, we need to be more remote. And we have begun to do this as well. There's challenges that come with that too. And I think there's a huge opportunity in order to advance how we think about remote measures, both in behavior and physiology. So with that, I will stop. Thank you.
Thanks, Virginia. I think it might be worthwhile, I think, just given our previous discussion, to ask you, I wonder, I think you've done some amazing work at developing and showing the value of more objective measures of affect, and you just touched on some of those just now. I wonder, you've probably had a lot of discussions with your colleagues about how to think about mapping some of the more fundamental aspects of arousal and valence when it comes to emotion research that you and your colleagues have done onto some of these constructs that we all recognize are a lot dirtier, just like we do with delayed free recall. It's obviously a really dirty construct that's clinically useful, but it has lots of different contributors to it. So I wonder if you might just say a few words about how to try to bridge the large gap between those.
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's a hard question, but I think the other speakers kind of touched on this too. It's like, deconstructing those big constructs of what is depression and like, what are the different components that make up depression, and thinking about it in a dimensional way. So rather than someone, crossing some threshold of a certain number of symptoms, like thinking about the potential biology of each of those different symptoms. And once we can, I think, break it down a little bit from the construct of these different, neuropsychiatric symptoms to their components, then we can more easily get to breaking it down even farther, to the level that I'm talking about. So we could begin to associate things like, dysregulated sympathetic activity to anxiety in preclinical Alzheimer's or something. I'm just kind of making that up, but I think that would be possible even with complex behaviors that we see in like VBFTD, right? Even here we struggle with, and people disagree about what to call something. Someone does a certain thing, we all know it's a little unusual and socially inappropriate, but what is it? And like, why are they doing it? Is it they don't understand the semantics of the situation, they're disinhibited and I can't hold them, rein in their impulses? Is it they don't understand, and feel other people's emotions, they don't have empathy? So it's really hard, but I think the more we can consider like the different mechanisms that drive the symptom, then we can break it apart this way. That's my thought.
Thank you. That's perfect. Why don't I open it up to the larger group for discussion? I think, Luke, it sounds like Bob and Laura may have something to say, and Liz Nielsen is here. So please.
Well, I'm happy to chime in and say I saw a lot of smiling psychologists in the room with that one comment about the importance of appropriate measurement for these factors. And I think that's part of the reason why, we really wanted to stimulate this discussion. So just appreciating it quite a lot. Nothing additional really to comment, except that as that conversation was unfolding, this current directions in psychological science on this very issue about how do we sort of diagnose mental disorders popped into my inbox, which seemed highly relevant. Thanks.
Yeah, and I was just going to say, building on what Bob said in his chat about prioritizing phenotypes, I didn't know if Bob and Laura, people that have been involved with like RDoC and some of the NIMH efforts to deconstruct these clinical, phenotypes in other areas may have thoughts or things.
I could just, chime in that it's so fascinating to think about how we can incorporate these novel phenotypes into causal models that can go both bottom up and top down in terms of the directions of validation. Because on the one hand, we have biomarkers to try to understand the biology of disease, try to understand how these different phenotypes actually mesh with those. On the other hand, we have real world outcomes and things that we want to be able to predict and try to come up with better prognoses and potentially interventions that will interact at biological targets and yield better outcomes. So to have complete systems level causal models that incorporate these new phenotypes is just going to be fantastic. And I guess it's a little dizzying thinking about, gee, how are we going to manage and wrangle all of these novel phenotypes, digest them in the ways that are going to be the most useful. And I'm thrilled that you all are doing this hard work.
I actually did have one other comment. I think I was struck by someone's comment about those individuals who have the awareness of their disease and the extent to which some of these behavioral reactions would be natural reactions to losing your ability to manage your everyday thinking or control your everyday life, and separating out, what's part of the disease process itself from what's a natural human reaction to the deterioration of one's function versus what's a risk factor will be a really tricky untangling, I think, of these phenomena.
I completely agree. I wonder if people might have thoughts. I think it still feels like we're operating in a prior era in many ways, although each of you presented some really exciting new ideas and new technology. But, if we're still using, at least in dementia research, a scale for measuring neuropsychiatric symptoms that was developed 30 years ago, that's a questionnaire or maybe a structured interview, depending on the setting. And that same is true for the neuropsychological assessment measures. ADAS-Cog, for example, the drugs are getting evaluated against is more than 30 years old. How can we begin to think about why is the field, so slow to adopt new technologies and to try to also maybe break some of these old constructs into component processes, as RDoC has tried to get us to do? Big picture questions, but do people have thoughts about those topics?
I don't want to be too triggered by all this, but I think that there's a huge validation inertia that sort of dogs us every day. We've been dealing with this with neuropsychological assessment, and trying to move things forward is really challenging. But it's because of the, primarily community of clinical neuropsychologists who, in performing their clinical work, have to rely on precedents of validity. And so they stick with the same old stuff. And we have a whole project now, this National Neuropsychology Network, just to try to show people what they're getting with the conventional assessments so that we could then hopefully move things forward. But it's a heavy lift. It's not the vendors. The neuropsychologists are often upset with the vendors, saying, "Oh, they don't have anything new." Well, the vendors are just trying to provide what the clinicians want. So, and look at Laura's been working hard on trying to introduce new measures, but it's a heavy lift, no?
Off the back of that, I'd love to hear the thoughts from the speakers on, we think about this inertia validation, right? Like, how much should we be taking these novel measures and validating them against things like the questionnaires that we've been using to look at neuropsychiatric symptoms, versus thinking them as completely new measurements, in which case, what do you validate against? Maybe a 20-year longitudinal study, but then now that really pushes down the road the ability to validate. So I just love your thoughts on that.
I think there's some lessons to be learned from the story of apathy, which started out as being part of depression, and I think that's sort of the one piece of the depression syndrome that seems to have separated itself out. And I don't know, there's a chicken and egg piece did that happen because it was clinically distinct from sort of melancholic depression, or did it happen because it's actually easier to self-report and for others to detect, or did it happen because in fact you can quantify it with a simple mobile phone or a wearable much better than you can something like, say, suicidality? But on the clinical side, the tipping point was that we then started studying treatments to see if they could target apathy, which is very different from whether they could target depression. So, we've seen things like stimulants, which used to be forbidden in older adults, now actually become standard of care for this one distinct syndrome. So I think that's one where there's been progress, and it's in some ways happened despite rather than because of a systematic move towards quantification. And I think if we were to sit and sort of look at that literature, I know of it piecemeal. I don't know if it's systematically, though I think much has been written on it. But there's a lesson there that we're now starting to treat at least apathy as distinct from all of its cousins in the DSM. And there's something to be said for looking at other behavior phenomena that can be carved out. Insomnia is another example. So the story of neuropsychiatry is sometimes when you have some way to address it clinically, that's when people really start to study it or get interested in it. So apathy is an example, insomnia might be another. We pay a lot of attention in the clinical setting around trying to do this, partly because of the nature of where we're located, but move away from diagnosing and treating depression and trying to get more precise about apathy and insomnia are the two that come to mind, but you could ostensibly do this across the entire spectrum. But we've talked about the FDA, and this is an NIH forum, but there's a third federal entity that messes all of this up, and that's CMS. That some of this it comes down to what you're going to get compensated for treating, and if the FDA is tried to precedent, so is CMS. So I think there's a whole messy ecosystem that maintains the inertia, and it's well beyond the purview of this conversation, but it must be acknowledged.
I think there are a couple of challenges that many researchers, Stephen Hayes and others, have shown that emotions are a spectrum. There is a daily hustle. Everybody experiences some anxiety, some depression in day-to-day life. And really, it's a little bit tricky. When is it pathological? So that's then the DSM tries to come up with symptom list, and I'm not sure how how rigorous it is from scientific research perspective. So therefore, emotions are tricky because it is part of the normal life, anxiety, etc. The thing about NPI is that it was done within the context of ADRD. So I'm not sure if it can be used in other settings. So they saw patients with, mesial frontal lobe and mesial temporal lobe lesions implicating the anterior cingulate, and then apathy was presenting. So they say, maybe we should start to measure apathy, and then they just added one sentence to NPI: without feeling depressed, does the person have difficulty with motivation? So if it implicates a particular structure, if a symptom implicates a particular structure, it seems relatively, it makes sense to pursue that. But depression is really, it implicates this or that structure. When in day-to-day life, when we experience depression, daily hustle, does it have biological basis, or how is that? We don't know these things. So therefore, really, the normal aspect of it is a challenge, but at least we are not fully using existing discoveries too. MMPI, for example, really they have systematically built the spectrum concept that now we are, NIMH has been pursuing, has been really done in 1945 by MMPI, an engineer and a psychologist. They always treated emotions on a spectrum. In fact, on one extreme pessimism, on another one, it could be extreme optimism. On one is a sociopathy scale. On one extreme is a paradigm shift, the critical thinker. On the other extreme is a criminal. They really came up with this model, but in day-to-day practice or in research, we don't use it that much in ADRD because it's long, 500 question. It's not feasible. So, but at any rate, I think, once again, I think teaming up, neurologists and psychiatrists teaming up with research psychologists who have had extensive training in psychometrics, I think we should optimize that. I'm not sure how. I was fortunate when I trained Ron Peterson, neurologist Glenn Smith, and we were in the same table every Tuesday. We used to discuss. It really gave me good insight. So I think I see that we have to optimize that low-hanging fruit. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonas. I do wonder, this has probably happened and I haven't been aware of it, but would it be a reasonable time to consider planning a workshop around the idea of these types of behaviors and what you might call biomarkers writ large of these kinds of behaviors that would be falling under the rubric of neuropsychiatric symptoms, with the idea that we've heard, at least touched on today, some really nice examples of movement, of autonomic nervous system function, of facial expression, but there are certainly a variety of other physiological or plasma-related or spinal fluid-related biological markers that might be worth having a workshop to update people on if that's something that hasn't happened in a while.
I think that ties to Kate Pawson's question in the chat around, what are the phenotypes that are less or more likely to be harbingers of dementia? The simple answer is we're not sure. We've only had the entity of MBI for about a decade now, and I don't think we've had digital or other digital biomarkers for less than that. But I think it's a priority area, and that if attention is paid there, I think there's huge implications. It's also sort of it lays bare that we've sort of thought of the cognition and the behavior aspects as these two distinct entities, when in fact they're, I think, far more enmeshed than anyone has realized. This is in the Alzheimer's or vascular space. I think it's different for frontotemporal dementia, but I think the recognition that there are deeper associations than we've possibly acknowledged clinically or research-wise, I think that needs to shift.
That's a great point, Ipsit. Virginia, I think you were going to say something.
Oh, I was just going to add, I think in an ideal world, we would know everyone's premorbid, all of these measures premorbidly and be able to track, because it's really the shift and the change that when we start to worry, right? Like we can meet people who are low on empathy just at baseline, and then they age and, then they're still low in empathy, and it's less concerning than if it's a big change. But some of these lines are so hard to draw when you've never met someone before, and whether the behavior is worrisome or just who they are. So, we're talking big picture ideal thinking here. So I think precision medicine for behavior and tracking each of us like over time would be the best way to hone in on for you what's the worrisome change, you know what I mean, from where you started. So that's my pie in the sky wish.
I think that I really liked Dr. Sturm, your I think it was the last slide where you talked about what are the things that we need to do digital phenotyping in a way that is clinically actionable and scalable. And it was automatic coding, remote assessment, and then innovations in data processing. I would add to that, based on what you just said, comparability over time, right? Because you can have all of those things, but the technology changes, and so therefore you can't compare time 1 to time 2. And that would be I think a fourth critical feature.
Definitely. Yes, I totally agree. Thank you.
So in clinical settings and impact in research as well, I try to always think of the classic Robert Hill criteria, did it happen? Did the exposure happen before the outcome? How much exposure was there? And for how long? If you take, for example, I think to follow up with Kate Poisson question here. Yvette Chalin, when she was at WashU, she showed that patients with severe and recurrent depression were the one who's, she did MRI work, so they had hippocampal atrophy. Not all depressed people, but only those who have severe depression and also recurrent, and that required hospitalization. So I think if it is severe and sustained over several years, I would be more concerned. But I think if it is really mild anxiety, in fact, we did a little pilot work. Steve Hayes, he suggests to make room for uncomfortable emotion. And then he gives his patients actually valued living questionnaire. And then he makes them work on this valued living questionnaire, committed action for day-to-day hustle. And at the same time trains them to make room for uncomfortable emotion. So it's very fascinating. So I think for emotions that are daily, that happen as part of daily hustle, and in order to make sure that they don't escalate to severe level, I think psychological interventions might help, I think.
So this has been an excellent conversation. Unfortunately, we're at time, but as I mentioned at the beginning, we have a sixth general discussion webinar where we're going to roll in questions, and certainly we can continue the conversation. I see people throwing references in the chat. Remember, everybody should also have access to the Box Drive where you can include papers and other resources there as well. So I just want to thank everybody. Brad, thank you for moderating all the speakers, the leadership committee as usual for your excellent guidance, and all the attendees for your good questions, your attention. Anything else you want to share? If you don't want to put it on Box, feel free to email myself or Ella Blue directly. Thank you to Ella behind the scenes running the show, and we'll see you hopefully at our next webinar, which is going to be, I believe, March 28th on clinical and real world measures. So have a good afternoon.